So I'm just reminding everyone, these are Jesus' words, not mine. Because I speak from a humble heart here. It's from Matthew 7, verses 1 to 6. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your sister, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First, take the plank out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's or your sister's eye. Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. The Gospel of Christ.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Take that verse.
I will. Yeah, I didn't do any object lessons for this one. Maybe I should have. Just for those who haven't been here this summer yet, what we're doing is working our way through the Sermon on the Mount. So we're calling it our Summer on the Mount. And I was reading the parallel passage in Luke this week, and Luke does the Sermon on the Plain, on the flat place. So interesting. I don't know how it could be a mount and a plain, but maybe we can go to the Holy Land and figure that out someday. Speaking of that, this week I was thinking about the reality, this weird reality that Jesus lived 2,000 years ago. And that number is kind of hard to get your head around sometimes, but I was reading a book by Peter Enns, and he likes to say that the distance between us and Jesus is the same distance between us and people in the year 4,000. Which, like most sci-fi authors, don't even want to go that far, right? Kind of puts it into perspective. But still, there's so much about humanity that remains consistent over those centuries. For example, our propensity to judge and to criticize. So 2,000 years ago, Jesus knew that his audience on the mount or on the plain was prone to that kind of judgment. I wonder if he thought, these folks are going to hear this teaching from me and feel like they automatically know better than all the rest of the folks around them. Just imagine if they had access to Twitter or Instagram or Facebook like us. I think we'd see things like, all you people who pray on the street corners are hypocrites, hashtag Jesus, hashtag Sermon on the Mount. Just criticizing everyone. There's this term that's become popular, especially on social media over the last couple of years, the term canceled. Have you guys heard this term? You're canceled. When someone or something is deemed to be problematic, another important term, and no longer worthy of support, they are canceled. They are publicly shamed. They are swiftly unfollowed or unsubscribed from. It's often because of a problematic tweet, unearthed from years ago often, or more rarely, a more recent wrongdoing. So these days it's often one strike and you're out in the social media world. I thank God that Twitter was not invented when I was an ignorant, problematic, self-assured 20-year-old, for example, probably even 25-year-old. Canceling people, though, is not just a social media thing. Evangelical Christians are very skilled at canceling. Does anyone, I'm dating myself right now, but does anyone remember when most Christians canceled Amy Grant? One of my first loves. First, she crossed over to radio-friendly music, which was problematic. And then she divorced and remarried, which is really bad. Today, evangelicals most often cancel people for not being anti-gay enough, I've noticed. You remember when Eugene Peterson got canceled and then uncanceled in the same 24-hour period? And apparently Beth Moore, of all people, is on the edge of cancellation now because she's been too friendly on Twitter with certain people, like a queer Christian, and yeah, so. But the thing is, when it comes to canceling, there is a plank in our eye as well. Progressive folks can be some of the worst offenders at this. People who are more left-leaning, whether in the church or otherwise, social justice types, are very good at criticizing oppressive systems and powers. And sometimes we end up turning that on individuals, on our own people, developing almost another kind of purity culture, where we hyper-vigilantly police each other's behavior and language. Too often we shame and call each other out for not being woke enough without giving people the time to process and learn things like we did. We also sometimes resist partnering or even conversing sometimes with people whose politics on maybe one issue don't align with ours. So in this context today, 2,000 years from when Jesus first said these words, what does it mean to hear Jesus say, do not judge? Does it mean that we should just let things slide? That we should just be okay with everything and everyone and not make any waves? Not judge them? I don't think that interpretation jives with the rest of the Sermon on the Mount. Because Jesus' sermon is all about making decisions about what kinds of behaviors and choices resonate with the kingdom of God and what don't. Just a few verses after this, which Mark is going to preach on, I think, eventually, or maybe it's in line after, Jesus is going to talk about a form of judging people, examining the fruit of someone's life to see whether or not they are a true prophet. So I think this kind of judging is more of a wisdom thing, more of a discerning, more of a critiquing all of the moral options that we have, and it's a necessary part of living in our world. So I think Jesus has to be referring to a stronger form of judging here, a sort of hypercritical, cynical way of life that goes beyond merely discerning, but is waiting to point out people's faults, eager to cancel them. The Greek verb used for judge that Jesus uses is krino, and I was reading that it's most often found in end times contexts, an apocalyptic kind of word associated with the final judgment. So perhaps a more helpful translation would actually be, do not condemn. Do not write off someone. Do not pretend that you know all the intricacies of someone's motives, of their heart. Do not consider anyone a lost cause beyond redemption. Don't act like you know God's final verdict over anyone's life. And Jesus doesn't just say, don't judge because it's wrong, period. He says, don't judge or you will be judged. It's very practical, actually. The Message version from the aforementioned Eugene Peterson reads, the critical spirit has a way of boomeranging. Makes a verb out of boomerang, I like that. Some think Jesus is talking about the boomerang coming from God, that God will judge us by the same measure that we use to judge others. And that would match up with Jesus' words from our last chapter that Mark preached on about how forgiveness of others impacts God's forgiveness of us. Those are linked things. But I think Jesus could also just be saying, what goes around comes around, like a boomerang. If we choose to see the worst in others, we should not be surprised if they apply that same lens to us. I've been spending this week pondering where our desire to judge and condemn comes from. I think it's often to do with insecurities. One of my most quoted people, Brene Brown, says, we don't judge people when we feel good about ourselves. It's when we feel like we're not good enough that we try to prop ourselves up by bringing down someone else and deflect away from our flaws by casting the searchlight on other people. So yesterday, when I made a mistake during a wedding ceremony and forgot to bring the vows, I comforted myself with the thought that at least it wasn't as bad as the officiant I heard about who mixed up 2 boxes in the marriage license and ended up accidentally marrying a woman to her father-in-law. So yes, I can comfort myself by looking at someone else's fault. But I think there's another motivation for our condemnation sometimes. Sometimes we feel like it's our job to defend God, or maybe to defend the faith, to defend the good, defend justice. We appoint ourselves as guardians and protectors of these things by calling out or excluding those who we see as threatening or deluding them. But God does not require this kind of protection from us. God would be good or godly or just if God depended on us to protect God's purity. Now, sometimes I think we're defending other people in our judgments. We're trying to protect People offer allyship to them, and sometimes they do need that from us. But even in those cases, it's so easy for us to slip into a vengeful mindset that wants to shame and punish and bully back the bullies. And we forget that Jesus' goal is to redeem the bullies and everyone else. We just sang that God will call the kingdoms to account, but God also wants to gather all of us in, to bring all of us home. And with all of these motivations, I think we can get so blinded with passion and compulsion to find fault that we miss the plank sticking out of our own eye. What a great image that is. It's become so commonplace that I think we miss some of the jarring absurdity of it. I think Jesus was really going for a laugh on this one. I think you got it. Like, the plank person can't even get close enough to the speck person to get something out of their eye. It's such a perfect way of capturing our human tendency to undervalue our own faults and overemphasize someone else's faults. With this verse, Jesus' do not judge becomes judge yourself. Kind of like Tony Campolo's reframing of love the sinner, hate the sin, into love the sinner, hate your own sin. And it's entirely possible that that sin, that plank, could be nothing less than our own self-righteous, holier-than-thou, sawdust-picking spirit. But something bugged me about this image as I was looking at it, beyond the sort of gross-out factor of something sticking out of your eye. And that was that it's not just a lesson in minding your own business. The two people in the metaphor go on to help each other deal with their issues. Plank eye and speck eye still need each other. When the problem is in your eye, a part of your body that by definition can't see itself, then you need help to be aware of it and to cure it. So in verse 5, we see that hypocritical plank eye is still the one who's removing speck eye as a speck. And honestly, this makes me uncomfortable. I would much rather deal with my own sins and failures privately, or pretend like I don't have them. It's so humbling and messy to have to depend on community for those things, for the self-awareness, for the support in healing those things. It requires letting down my guard, receiving help for things that I feel like I should have control over. It involves disciplines like confession and repentance and accountability that have burned so many of us in our past church experiences. And I'm tempted to just throw them out with the bathwater of all of those experiences and pretend like I don't need them. But I think that risks over-individualizing my journey and making me vulnerable to plank size and blind spots. I think what we can do is reserve this accountability for people who have developed a healthy sense of their own wood. In other words, people who have the humility about their own failings and the mutuality to both give and receive help in the inner work that's needed on our common journey toward looking more like Christ. Some of you might have read a book by Henry Nouwen called The Wounded Healer. And in that book, he hypothesized that our wounds, our sufferings, our not having our shit together, these are not liabilities when it comes to doing God's work in our communities. These parts of us actually give us the humility and the experience to be able to help other people as weak and wounded healers who are following the footsteps of Jesus, the ultimate wounded healer. But this can also be complicated sometimes when we share a similar woundedness. I was reading an article this week about why queer people tend to be especially mean to each other. Why queer people are mean to each other. And the writer talked about our shared trauma and our sense of constant danger. The fear, the shame, the hypervigilance that we have before coming out. And then the rejection and betrayal and sometimes abuse that many of us experience after coming out. And these experiences create these neural pathways and rewire our brain to put us in survival mode a lot of the time. We're so easily flooded with adrenaline and cortisol and reverting to black and white thinking that's necessary in emergencies, but not usually in everyday life. And that causes us to make these snap judgments about whether someone is friend or foe. We don't see the gray in between. So we intend to react to each other in defensive and untrusting ways. Still, I think that when queer people or any other marginalized group that's shared trauma like this can learn how to let our guard down and meet each other precisely in that place of wounding, we can find healing together. I've seen it happen. I've seen people find the safety of that love, of that mutual understanding, and start to switch out of survival mode. Instead, releasing oxytocin and dopamine and these beautiful chemicals that begin to rewire our brains in more compassionate and less reactive ways. So we become better at slower responses of mercy and grace and giving people the benefit of the doubt. The sad reality is that not everyone is going to respond well to those things. And I think that's why Jesus started talking about dogs and pigs. Now, sometimes we have warm, fuzzy feelings about dogs and pigs, but in Jesus' days, dogs were half-wild, starving, vicious mongrels who traveled in packs and would attack people for food. And pigs were considered, of course, very unclean, and also were quite savage in the wild. So they're not the cute animals from the motivational posters. He's saying, don't give your sacred things, your pearls, to these dangerous, unclean animals. It's a very weird verse, as you pointed out, Joy. It has several interpretations. Some people think he's saying, save your evangelism for those who are already primed to listen to it. And other people think that he's saying, don't let the wrong people receive communion. But Jesus was always eating with the wrong people, so it's not my favorite interpretation. I think it has more to do with what Jesus has already been talking about here. The sacredness of our vulnerability, of our gracious approach to each other. When you approach people with humility, with mercy, ready for relationships, some will respond by attacking you in that vulnerable place. And in those cases, I think Jesus frees us to shake the dust off of our feet and resist wasting time offering ourselves up over and over to those who will not listen and will not receive us. Jesus did this himself when it came to people who were self-righteous and who were just trying to trap him. Instead of letting his pearls be trampled by them, he would hide his pearls by wrapping them in parables and riddles, and only later revealing the meaning to uneducated people and children. Jesus' use of pig and dog language here does sound fairly judgmental, but I think that this verse actually helps us when it comes to resisting the temptation to judge. Because when we're trying over and over again to force people to receive our grace, our sacredness, only to have them reject it repeatedly and mock us and attack us, sticking around in that scenario will only make us more bitter and judgmental toward them. So when we're free to go and take our pearls to those who will receive them, it prevents us from dwelling in judgment on those who reject them. Jesus is not asking us to be walked all over. If you were here for my sermon about loving our enemies and turning the other cheek, you saw that there was a lot more going on there with power dynamics. And sometimes we need to put distance between ourselves and those who threaten to attack us. And this again requires an exercise in discernment, the good and necessary kind of judgment, to figure out the nuances between, on the one hand, putting up healthy boundaries and expressing righteous anger about people committing injustice, and on the other hand, completely condemning them or writing them off. To use a rather extreme example, I'm not going to waste a lot of time trying to connect or offer mercy to the 45th President of the United States. Not that he would necessarily listen to me. And I don't think it's un-Christ-like to say that he is abusing his power and to call for his access to power to be removed, or at least his access to Twitter. But still, I will not put it past God's unlimited power to reach someone like that. Maybe God will give him the Nebuchadnezzar treatment and make him believe he's a cow and act like a cow for a long time. I don't know if you've read Daniel 4 lately, but I was reading it and I Googled that as well, and it's called boanthropy, believing you are a cow. And that really worked for Nebuchadnezzar. He ended up humbling himself and serving God, so who knows, right? There's a man named Alexander Solzhenitsyn, I think I said his name right, he's a survivor of the gulags, and he wrote, "If only it were so simple, and there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and all we had to do was destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being." I find it helpful to imagine each person almost like a mini battleground. The battle between their best and their worst selves continues to the end. And some First Nations people would call that the good wolf and the bad wolf, and it depends which one you're feeding. And we can enter into that as these wounded healers, as medics on the battlefield. Some here are peacemakers, peace lovers, and if you prefer a less violent image, more agricultural, Jesus tells a story in Matthew 13 about wheat and weeds, or wheat and tares, and how even the angels didn't have the skill to figure out which was which until the very last days. Once we faced our own weeds, our own worst self, our own human potential for evil, we are no longer shocked at the darkness that we see from others. To quote Henry Nouwen from The Wounded Healer again, he says, "Through compassion, we sense our hope for forgiveness in our friends' eyes and our hatred in their bitter mouths. When they kill, we know that we could have done it under the same circumstances. And when they give life, we know that we can do the same. For a compassionate person, nothing human is alien." And in that last bit, he's quoting a former slave who said that in, I think, 200 BC. This deep shared humanity is a potent source of grace. Knowing that, oh, to grace how great a debtor daily I'm constrained to be. This primes us for mercy, and to be shown mercy. Because this whole passage is really just a backwards version of that beatitude. Blessed are the merciful. Now, Mark and I have been challenging ourselves to get super practical in these Sermon on the Mount sermons. So I want to close with some things that I've found helpful when it comes to judging. One, I'm trying to get really good at identifying my own inner critic. You know, that voice inside your head that tells you that you're worthless, that you're not good enough, that you're not beautiful enough, whatever your insecurity happens to be. I've been told that it's helpful to give it a name. Like, you could call it Ned Flanders, or Professor Umbridge, or something like that. And give it a tone of voice, even. And it will help you to notice it, to shake your head and say, oh, there goes Professor Umbridge again. And just to distinguish that so clearly from the loving voice of the Good Shepherd. We need to be able to tell the difference between those things. Two, I've been trying to steadily work on digging up the roots of my own judgmentalism. So that could be for you trauma, insecurity, the felt need to defend things that don't need defending. Therapy can be really good for this. Number three, I'm trying to remind myself that the difference between calling someone out and calling someone in is pretty much just love and the motivation for mutual healing. So calling in tends to refer to approaching someone privately about something you notice that is not right. Some planks can be pointed out gently like that. Other times it must happen in public, but can still be done without dehumanizing someone or resorting to the kind of shaming that really feeds that cancel culture. Four, I'm trying to practice removing people from pedestals before they have a chance to fall off of them. Just intentionally seeing people as human, as that mix, as that battleground, as the weed and the weeds. Including myself. Don't let my mess surprise any of you. If I'm on a pedestal, take me off, and let the people in our lives make mistakes and learn from them. And then five, when we see someone accused of or admit to some fault or failing, instead of perpetuating that outrage machine and that shock, we can just take that as a prompt to reflect on our own potential for the same. So, for example, when a celebrity says something racist, instead of sort of feeling smug and like, oh, I would never do that, we can identify that the same seeds of racism are in ourselves, seeds that all too easily grow into planks as we are participating in racist systems. So we can let this reminder spur us on to anti-racist action instead of dwelling on someone else's mistake. And my final thing is a challenge for you, and it's a dangerous challenge, so I understand if you're resistant. But this week, I wonder if you could ask somebody that you love and trust, and you have humility and mutuality with them, whether there are any blind spots in your life that they think you maybe could start to address. And then practice the humility of receiving what they might say to you. That's a tough one, but, no kid gloves here. So you have a blue slip of paper in your bulletin, mine fell on the floor. But I invite you to take the next few minutes to write something in response. There's some extra pens up here on the table if you need one. anything that's come to mind from reading this passage, from listening. It could be an intention, it could be a word, a phrase, a name. And then you can leave it on the table when you come up for communion. You can keep it if you prefer. You can light a candle and stick it in the sand and put the folded up blue paper beside it if you want. Or if you prefer, after some silence that I'll leave, you can come and light a candle and share your reflections with us aloud during the open sharing time that we're going to have right after this. So as you reflect, may you rest in the presence of God, the judge who is abounding in mercy, and in the presence of Jesus who refused to cancel someone like Peter even after 3 strikes and will not cancel you, and of the Spirit, the go-between God, who brings us friends who are able to remove scales and planks from our eyes. In the name of these holy, merciful 3. Amen.